Can everyone hear me? Yes? Great. We're going to get started in just a moment. We're waiting for Myriam to join us. Hopefully she's in the building. My name's Galit. I'm going to be playing a recording for you, and then I'm going to say a few words, and then I'll introduce you to our speakers. And then we're going to have time for Q&A, questions and answers, and then Mike and or Ayala are going to come up for closing, okay? So listen carefully. What you're about to hear is our guest today, Vernon, his bar mitzvah portion from 1936 in Germany, when, like many of you or soon-to-be future you, he had his bar mitzvah. So you're going to hear a little crinkly static for those of you in high definition. It might sound a little unusual, but bear with us for a few minutes, and there's an introduction in German. Okay, so have a listen.
Den Baumgesang, gesungen am 5. September 1936 von Vernon Leopold.
So, I don't know if you recognized any words there with that German accent, but he was saying Baruch Atah Adonai and a few other words that I'm sure you may have studied at some point. As I said, my name's Galit. I'm the chair of the Kadima Advisory Committee, and I'm also on the board at BJ. I need to take my glasses off to read to you. So, Yom Hashoah, or Holocaust Remembrance Day, was established on the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which began on the first night of Passover, 1943. 2 weeks ago, for the first time since that uprising, 100 Jewish families gathered to celebrate the Passover Seder at the site of the Warsaw Ghetto, traveling from Israel, Europe, and the United States to do so. During Pesach, we recite the ancient chant, Vehi She'amda, which roughly translates to, in every generation there are enemies who rise up against us. But we have survived, persevered, and we have thrived. During the painful period of Yom Hashoah, it's important to tell the stories not only of those that attempt to do us harm, but also of the friends and allies who show their solidarity, support, and courage. They too help protect the Jewish people and ensure our survival. I'm honored today to welcome you to the BJ Sanctuary to hear our member, Vernon Leopold, tell his story about all those that helped him and his family during Hitler's rise in Germany. This led him and his family to immigrate to the US, and eventually he returned to Germany as part of the US Army's most decorated platoon of World War II. When Sarah and I think, were making challah dough one day, she shared with me the story of her father, and I knew that we needed to invite him. I was particularly struck by the fact that Vernon was as old as many of you are today when everything started happening in Germany. And so he can give you a perspective for what it was like for a child around your age when things started happening. In a moment, Vernon will be interviewed by Myriam Abramowicz. She is a BJ member, a filmmaker, teacher, social activist, and global humanitarian, and she herself is a child of Holocaust survivors. As I said, we're going to hear from Vernon and Myriam, and then we'll take your questions, okay? Mike did ask me to take maybe a few seconds for, if there's someone sitting next to you that you don't recognize, could you say a quick hello and introduce yourself? He would like our new visitors to be welcomed in the BJ style. Yes. All right, thank you. And again, I just want to take a moment. Sarah is a BJ mom like I am. She has two beautiful daughters, Jackie and Phoebe. Are you both here? Can you wave hello? They're waving like this, but they're up in the front. And Sarah and I have been organizing this for the past few months now. So we do hope you enjoy, and please join me in welcoming Myriam and Vernon.
Thank you very much. Good evening and welcome to B'nai Jeshurun. We're honored to have you and to have Vernon and Sarah and Galit to thank for this gathering and the reason that we are here sitting together. We had a chance to meet, the four of us, a few weeks ago, and I was very struck by the coincidences that were evoked and that took place in Vernon's life with the many things that we find out about the Shoah, and that there really are no coincidences, actually. Someone said that coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And so here we are. And Vernon, hello. I'm going to ask you to just tell us a little bit about your trajectory and perhaps a little bit too about what it was like to be a child before the war.
Well, I wouldn't know where to begin. First of all, I asked for, I don't sing like that anymore today. I did in those days. I was 13 years old on September the 5th, 1936. I had my bar mitzvah in Düsseldorf, Germany, although I was born in Frankfurt am Main, which is a wonderful city. But I had enjoyed the bar mitzvah. It was a very, very memorable event, and it was typical of bar mitzvahs, bar mitzvot, enjoyed by children of my age group in Germany at that time. And then shortly thereafter, on the end of September, I was taken to England, and I spent the next, not quite 3 years in London, all by myself. It was difficult. I remember when I separated from my mother, it was something that is reawakened every time I read a story about children and mothers and fathers who put them on the Kindertransport. This was not the Kindertransport. This was about 2 years before then. But much is owed to the City Council or the Jewish Welfare Federation of London at Woburn House for having made this possible, and in their own quiet way. That's where I learned English. It took me just about 3 weeks to be able to make myself understood sufficiently to be able to go to the school that they had in mind for me, where I could then follow instruction. This went on until then. But during those years, next 3 years, I was still able to go and spend my home and spend my vacations from school with my parents in Düsseldorf. And that's when first began to see in my own way what difference there was. between attitudes, the mentality of people, and what I found in Great Britain, in the first Anglo-Saxon speaking country that I saw, that came to live in. We came to the United States in July 1938. We were able to bring our household belongings and no money whatsoever. We were fully dressed. We came and we landed. We had a very good trip over on the New Amsterdam, but then things changed once we landed.
Before,
That's right.
Vernon, I'm going to ask you just to go back a little bit. Before you leave Germany, do you experience anti-Semitism there, the beginnings?
Yes, of course. First of all,
Can you describe some of those?
harassment in schools. Germans like semi-military or type organizations, and the Boy Scouts were well represented, and the Hitler Youth was, and the Jungvolk, which is a kind of a group of the Hitler Youth, up children before the age of 14 were indoctrinated. We used to have daily performances in the assembly hall, school assembly. Everybody appeared in uniform. Germans liked uniforms, and of course Jewish kids were not allowed to do anything. Were not included in anything, and it increased.
Were you aware that these conditions were changing for you, or was it so subtle that it was a movement into another stage? I mean, how did you live through that?
Well, we lived through it because, first of all, we encountered anti-Semitism on the streets even before the Nazis came. There was always some anti-Semitism. I think it's endemic to Europe, unfortunately. But in this particular instance, yes, the Nazi movement was gaining strength. It started as far back as 1929, and even earlier than that. There was a disposition to be socially anti-Semitic, if not actually, but people did not associate too well with Jews, and because Jews were completely emancipated and were as German as the people around them in terms of living there.
Did your family?
You could begin to feel it was getting worse because we couldn't use first things. We were unable. We were prevented from using the swimming pools. We were prevented from using libraries. Things took. There was always another regulation, which was to hem in the Jewish community. The Jewish community was very strong. It held out, and it had civil rights, which it enforced as much as they could. But as years went by, it was getting worse. We could not. We used to get religious classes from a cantor who came once a week, and did after we were in the second grade, and we had Hebrew. And first we had biblical history and then Hebrew, but so did every other religion. We weren't any different. Jews had the cantor, and the other religions had the priest or pastor come to the school. The kids were segregated, and that's how it just was, even before the Nazis. It's not like anything here. So,
Could I ask you, in terms of home life, did you observe the Shabbat and the high holidays, or what were?
Yes, we did. My father came from an Orthodox family, not Orthodox. Observant is the word I prefer, because Orthodox implies that there was a difference in denomination. There was never one, and it was. It always had been this. It had been that way. I don't know if I answered your question. I got stuck here someplace. Ask your Ryan to repeat the question, please.
Well, I wanted to know whether you had the holidays as we
Oh, yes.
know to observe them here. It was a Shabbat or Pesach, the Seder, or Rosh Hashanah, Kippur.
Absolutely. In my family, from earliest childhood, we went to synagogue. We belonged to a nice old synagogue. The services were complete. There was no abbreviation. Everything was recited, and particularly in Frankfurt, traditional.
And everyone loved the matzah, remember?
What?
You said everybody loved the matzah.
Yeah, the matzahs were somewhat different. They were round matzahs, and they were unlike here where we can wear these square matzahs. And the round matzahs were somewhat thinner, as I remember, because when we used to crumble them up and put them in white cups, and we ate them for cereal with milk and coffee over them, matzah broken. I didn't care for that very much. There was no substitute for real cereal. And but we kept it. We went to synagogue on Shabbat. We had Hebrew school. We had religious classes in school and outside of school. And as the Nazi movement gained strength, we even tightened up on it. I think the participation grew, and but the German Jewry had been organized, always had, for welfare purposes, for intellectual events and everything else.
What about, how did you meet the Goldmans who brought you to London?
Well, in 1936, after my bar mitzvah, or even during that summer, we took a vacation. We drove to the Belgian coast, to Flanders, to the area of Ostend, and we took quarters in Blankenberge. That's the Flemish name for it. But I was preparing for my bar mitzvah when my younger brother began to play the bar mitzvah, play the Hatikva on the piano, at least to sound it out. And we found out that they were British people, English people, who suddenly took an interest in us, whom we could never really connect to. And they became friendly, invited us from Monday to the next, invited us for tea in the afternoon. It turns out that their name was Goldman, and they had a boy my age, or a little younger, and they became very friendly and sincerely so. They felt sorry at first. They confessed it later. They thought we were a family of Nazis because we spoke German among one another. That's the language we used. And somebody asked me today, what kind of German? We spoke what's known as Hochdeutsch, which is the German, the proper German spoken, actually in the town of Bremen, I understand. But we made friends with them, and then when I was taken to England, I spent all of my weekends with them. It was they made my life in England very enlightened. I would have been extremely homesick if they hadn't offered me an outlet, so to speak. What else? And then.
No, go ahead.
And then, when the ship left, we were sailing for America. They came to the ship docked in Southampton after leaving Rotterdam in Holland, or across the channel. They stopped in Southampton, as I said, and the Goldmans, Harold and Dolly, had come to the ship and brought us a farewell gift. Beautiful silver carafe. And we then said goodbye. There were tears shed. And then when we were in the States, we kept contact. And then the war came, and they lost their home. It was in a Houndsditch, and a bomb struck the house. And ultimately, after I came out of the hospital in England, after I had suffered trench feet, they came to visit me in the hospital, and they were the ones who notified my parents that I had survived, because I had written home in coded language, corresponded with them, and they knew exactly where my unit, my little platoon, was stationed. So when the Germans broke through, they found out where I was. They knew where I was.
Myriam has a question. I think maybe
Go ahead.
Yes. So here we are. You arrive in Detroit in 1938.
By 1938.
Yes. And how do you make? What happens then, and how is it that you make your way back to Germany?
Well, when we came, we came without any kind of money. Going to college or higher education was beyond our aim. We even were prepared by our parents that he would have to do manual labor. But it didn't turn out this way. I went to high school, which was free, Cass Technical High School in Detroit, and graduated in '41. And then I took jobs in machine shops. And eventually, Army came, and I couldn't volunteer or enlist in anything because I was an enemy alien in those days. We were all Germans. The fact that we were Jewish was not even looked at. And so when I was in the Army, I was drafted in July. I took active service on July 20th, 1943. And when I was in the service, I did basic training in the infantry. Ready? Grunt work. Our country had suffered heavy casualties in the Italian campaign at the Anzio beachhead and elsewhere. They needed 100,000 men. That we would get back to that. And anyway, I was in the I was ultimately wound up in the intelligence reconnaissance platoon of the 340th Infantry Regiment, and that regiment was one of the 3 components of the 99th Infantry Division. I went overseas with them, and then we found ourselves, after 1 month or so, in an observation post on the flank of the division, because the Army was planning an attack in the Hürtgen Forest to the north of us. And while there, I froze my feet. And they didn't have shoes my size. The supply lines hadn't moved up after the Normandy breakthrough.
Why were you outside so much that you froze your feet? How did that happen?
Well, I didn't have shoes my size.
But who was making you be outside?
They didn't ship the supplies through. And I had to go on patrol. I went on parole, on patrol, night patrols, date patrol. And when my platoon lost one of the members due to frost injuries, they had to carry him out. My platoon leader saw me and he said, "Look, you better go back with him and have the aid station, 8-man, look at your feet. You haven't been able to treat them." I'd been treating them for a month or so because we don't want to lose you. I went back and never came back. And I told to Chris, who was it? Go ahead.
Yes. I want the children to have a chance to ask you some questions. So I want the children to have a chance to ask you some questions also, but just in terms of your chronology, once you're in Germany, are you ever interrogated by Germans or asked questions as to how come you're an American soldier and you speak German so well?
No, fortunately not.
Okay.
I would not have survived that. Because the person who ultimately attacked the position of my platoon in the field, by that time I was already in the hospital. I found out about that later. But it was a fellow by the name of Jochen Piper. He was a very friend of Hitler, very cruel SS colonel, who is responsible for the death of 100 American GIs, not too far from where we were. He just killed them. Machine guns, it's just like in camps, in the extermination camps. And I would not have even lasted that long with him if I had been caught, spoke German. That would, and I would not have lasted. And I didn't find out the true story of any of this, because by that time, when the breakthrough started, it was a day after I had been sent to the aid station by my platoon leader to have my feet examined. And I was, and to my good fortune, yet retrospect, I was immediately transported, put on an evacuee train, bound for the interior of France, and ultimately wound up in England in a hospital. And meanwhile, I knew nothing about my platoon, but happened to it. But I heard the next morning, after the breakthrough, when I was on the train, that the Germans had attacked precisely at the point where my platoon was, right where we were stationed. And they held them back for just about 12 hours with ammunition they had. And then at the end, they had to surrender because they ran out. If I had been caught there, I would not have survived. On the other hand, if I had, assuming that I had survived and gotten away from them and fled and somehow found my way back, tried to get back to our lines, there was a German officer by the name of Skorzeny, intelligence officer, another friend of Adolf Hitler, who their men were infiltrating in American uniform. And the purpose of their breakthrough of their mission was to seize the bridges in Belgium so as the American army in defense could not do anything, were hindered in the defense. And the breakthrough was actually shunted by this platoon who fought for 12 hours, not knowing what was going on. They were told by the high command to hold at all costs. They didn't believe a breakthrough was in progress until much later. And I survived. That was a miracle. Then I found out about that the following morning when I was on the evacuee train bound for the interior of France. And
when did you find out they were alive?
Then I found out.
When did you finally find out that they were alive?
Okay, I lost them completely. I could not reestablish contact. I tried to write to some survivors, when I thought there might be survivors. Nobody responded, so I forgot about it. It was a loss. And I spent the next 30 years only occasionally remembering it, but vestiges of it. And I didn't I didn't discuss this with my children or anyone in the family. It was a chapter of my life. Then one morning, I'll never forget it, in 1977, I was opening a paper in Florida, the Dallas News, the Fort Lauderdale News, which is now the Sun Sentinel. And there was a Parade magazine insert, and there was an article by Jack Anderson, Drew Pearson's successor. How this platoon showed a picture of the soldier in the front, why he should get the Medal of Honor. And I opened the pages and I read the whole story of my platoon. Every foxhole, every position was told very vividly by Jack Anderson, and how they finally had to surrender, and how we are now looking, this platoon deserves to be honored, and the young man in front who had his face practically shot away in the injuries he suffered, he has since died, he was pictured. So I called my former commanding officer the following morning and said to him, Lieutenant Bauk, I read the article in Jack Anderson wrote in magazine, but I was a member of your platoon. And there's a moment of silence, and he says to me, yeah? He says, how are your feet? That's how he greeted me. how are your feet? And I was reunited. It reminded me of the story of Joseph and his brothers in the Bible. It was a tearful period in my life to suddenly relive all of this. Newspaper reporters wrote about the story, and a book has since been published by Alex Kershaw about the longest winter, which explains the whole thing. And a miracle was that I found him. The miracle was that of all the platoons and all the units in the army, that just this platoon, which is just an insignificant group of 28 people, stood out in this event. And so unknown to, and I'm almost ashamed to say, I wasn't there. I was lucky, and I thank God that I was there, but I had mixed feelings, and I harbor them every day. And when I came back to my office, my law office, and thereafter, I used every bit of influence I had. I was politically active at the time in the Democratic Party to work on the task of getting the law changed so that this platoon could be honored, and the young man whose face was shot away would get the Medal of Honor. Well, we only partly succeeded, but you got the book, it's there. Yeah.
So
that's the story.
We're going to have the children ask you a question, but I just want to close that chapter because you mentioned your law office. So you went to the university and got your undergrad degree, and then you went to Harvard Law School?
That's another miracle, because I certainly could not financially afford going to Harvard or even to Michigan or Wayne State University. But we had something that was done by the government for all veterans. They had the GI Bill of Rights. There were two bills, 346, and the other one was 512, I think, for people who had been wounded and had gone. We all got a time for higher education in proportion to the time we served in the Army in World War II. And that made it possible for me to actually spend at the allocated time that I could find at the University of Wayne, actually at the University of Michigan, and get my bachelor's degree, and then I was admitted to Harvard Law School for my legal education. I picked the best I thought I could find at the time for the money that I was able to, the grants I was able to obtain under Public Law 346 and 16. So that's the story, and I make no bones about it.
So I'm going to turn it over to Galit, who's going to select the next question for you from the audience.
Okay, so everyone or most of you should have gotten a little note card and a pencil. So if you want to take a moment, and for those of you that have questions and or comments that you want to make, why don't you take a moment to write that down, and then we will go through and try to get as many questions as we can answered, and then we'll invite Mike and Ayala up to finish up.
This one?
All right, we have our first. Oh no, that's okay. And please say your name.
It's an honor to meet you. My name is Richie Shane, and I wonder, were you drafted or did you enlist? You had a unique background. How did it?
Well, I couldn't enlist. I wanted to go in the Air Force, follow in my father's footsteps, and be a flyer like he was in World War I, although for the different side. But I couldn't do it because I was an enemy alien at that time, and even so, when I was naturalized and came back, I was drafted, actually. I had to wait till I was drafted, and then when I was drafted, I could volunteer for induction, because even a draftee is not taken immediately. But I thought I'd do the next best thing. Maybe if I volunteer for induction, but makes me immediately available, I can get a decent assignment. I may have a voice in it. It didn't work out that way. Okay? I think that answers your question.
Thank you. And we have a question here. Do you want to stand up and ask your question? And say your name. Come over here so you can see.
Speak up.
Hi. Who did you live with in London?
What?
Who did you live with in London?
Oh, in London, the Jewish, committee had provided for me to be with a family, with a lady by the name of Mrs. Leeuwarden. She was a Dutch Jewish immigrant, and her father. They lived in north of London, and she was very nice to me, but I was very, very homesick at first, and I made a comparison to my home at life was, I don't think I really appreciated her. She wasn't warm-hearted or anything. It was seemed kind of cold. But the Goldmans, the people we met in Belgium, when they invited me on weekends, they more than made up for it. And there was always this conflict between the two. But I adjusted. It was immediate. The first few couple of weeks were rough. And eventually, when I got into the routine of things, and
Tell her the interesting thing about the Leeuwarden family.
well, they had a habit. They loved to read, and because I was brought up, you don't read when at a dinner table. But they got books from the library. They had tall water glasses, and they opened their books. And they opened their books at night, all of them, all around the table. And when I asked the question, I said, shh, shh, shh. And as they turned the pages, they didn't want to be interrupted. So it was, you thought that was an interesting story. I didn't think it was so.
I love that story.
You love the story. I don't think it's one of, I thought it was one of the lesser events. There's
another question.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rachel.
Hi, Rachel.
While you were fighting in the war, where was your family?
Well, my family lived in Detroit. We were in Detroit. My father had worked in a defense factory during the war. And my mother, I think they took in a couple of boarders, and so they made go. But that's how we survived. And then I came back. I immediately started college. Wayne, go ahead. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lenore. I wanted to go back to when you were in England and your family was still in Germany. Could you tell us, did they suffer at all under the Nazis before they left in those 2 years when you were away?
No, they led the life I had, except for the psychological impact, which they had suffered. But they lived like everybody else, Jew or Christian, of middle class. As long as my father was still he was a what do you call it, manufacturer's rep, and he worked. He was able to work and travel. But it was, you could see the Nazi world closing in. I don't know how to describe it. It was a tremendous psychological pressure. I went to Germany during school vacation, and I saw what was going on compared to a free country like England. You see things, and the attitude of people were different. What else can I say? Go ahead.
I'm Matthew. Between the time when you were in Germany and America, like Detroit, when you were in London, did you ever like worry that you weren't gonna see your parents again, or did you like worry that you like would never go back to like your friends and everybody that was there?
Well, we lived that way, yes. It was unexpressed. Of course. We had no way of knowing what the future would bring. And meanwhile, while I was in London, the whole family was preparing to leave Germany, exploring every means. I remember my father asked me to go to the Australian consulate and find out what papers were needed to apply for a right to emigrate to Australia. And there were other things that we did. We certainly had money. There was a fellow we met in London who liked cigars that you could only get in Germany. So my father bought a couple of boxes of cigars, which I took to England and and he paid me for it. There were ways you couldn't take money out. There's nothing that they could do for me, and we didn't want to be dependent on anybody. So, box of cigars here, maybe some perfume or something else. You could get it in Germany, you couldn't get it in England. The tastes were different. So, yeah, where else? Yes, sir.
Hi, Vernon. I'm David. Thank you for coming. My question is, in 1938, as your family made the decision to leave and come to the United States, what specifically happened to help them reach that conclusion that you needed to leave at that time?
Well, it's a conclusion that's being made for you if things kept getting worse. My father, of course, was, as I said, he was a German officer, a flyer in World War I. So he was civically German, and religiously, in all his attitude, he was Jewish. A good, observant Jew from a good Jewish family, from the countryside. So it took a while.
The officers tell him.
He belonged to the German Officers Club. This was an organization of German officers who served in battle on World War I. And when the Nazis Nazified that organization, called it Gleichschaltung. That means making it synonymous with the Nazi movement. My father tendered his resignation. He said, "There's no place for me here." And they said to him, we will not accept your resignation. You are one of us. You're a brother. Just stay with us. Things will change. There came a time when it got worse, where they saw it, and the same man same friend who told him that, came back, told him, "Look, time has come. See where you can go. Make arrangements to go to leave. There's no future for you here." And so he did. He did it. He made sure that his sister in Getna went to Palestine, and his brother also. Once he had arranged for his family to go to Palestine, he felt free to leave, and we left. We worked. We got affidavits of undertakings to support, which were required. We came. Anybody else? Sir.
Hi, I'm Marissa. Did you make good friends with any of the men you were fighting with?
Pardon me, could you repeat?
Did you make good friends with any of the men you were fighting with?
Were you friends with any of the men you were fighting with?
No, fighting with in the army?
Who were soldiers with you? Did
Oh,
any of them
yes.
good friends?
First of all, my platoon. The platoon members are like brothers. And today, I am now the last sole survivor of that group. Everybody is gone as far as I know. I'm not 100% sure, but you read this book, the 28 people of the INR platoon, intelligence and reconnaissance platoon, have all gone now. And I'm very sad about it because we have our 75th anniversary coming up on December the 6th of this year. But I was very close friends with them once I found them. But I didn't know about them for 30 years. That's right. Did not know them. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, we're going to do a couple more and then to Mike and Ayala.
So I'm Ruthie. Do you feel that by fighting you made a difference to all the people who are suffering, and did you feel that way while you were fighting?
Could you, the message, could you please repeat that question? Oh.
I think she means, as you were fighting in Germany, did you feel like you were helping, doing something good?
Yes,
for
of course.
What happened to?
I felt very strong. We were defeating the Nazis. We were winning in Germany, and I saw the evidence. Villages in ruins and all of that in Germany. I saw it in France and Belgium, but to see it in Germany gave me some satisfaction. But then one day I had an experience. I was traveling by jeep with part of the technical intelligence units that I had been placed in. I spent an evening in Frankfurt, my birth city, and I saw that I had spent my earliest childhood, first 4 years of my life, where all my mother's family came from. Some of my father's family were living there. We had deep, long-going ties that went all the way back to the 1200s, I think. And I saw everything in ruin. And I cannot describe the feelings. They were unexpected. I wasn't prepared for it. I was not prepared for the reaction. I didn't feel like a conquering hero at that point. And it's an emotional experience, and it changed something. And I felt no sympathy for the people that suffered, but I saw the whole horror of all of this realistically. It's a different feel.
Just one more question.
My name's Samantha. When you joined the Army, were you scared?
Yes, I was scared, but I also was full of pep. And I wanted to go back and do something in the war against Germany. The country had spat me out and my family out of their home. And but that changed. That changed. I felt that way through most of the war. And when we came to march into Germany, I felt a great deal of satisfaction. And I think I've explained it before. I did. And I felt, and there's a picture in this book that that some of you have gotten a copy of or seen it, which shows me standing in Berchtesgaden in Hitler's eagle nest in front of this open window, which allows him to see the into Czechoslovakia or whatever. And I felt like I felt like I had won the war. But then I went to Frankfurt afterwards. That was a different experience. So I felt it both ways. You cannot deny your childhood. At least the physical remembrances of them. They're with you. And some of you are here who I presume know the feeling. It's a conflict. You live with it. And that's it. And you got to.
Okay, please join me in thanking Sarah, Vernon, and Myriam for coming to speak with us today. And handing it over.
I must apologize for having spoken too fast. There's too much to tell, and I cut it short as I could. I'm also hoarse. I don't have the voice that I had when I was bar mitzvah. Okay, thank you.
So we are so grateful for you being here and for sharing your story, your testimony. And we, at the end of when we get to hear these, we get to honor and think about those lives that have been lost, those lives that have been murdered. And so we've asked a few volunteers to come up to read what I know Galit has the slide for. And as we read it together, there's a line at the end after each candle, before each candle is lit, that we say, "We shall never forget." So I just want to practice with you right now so that we can do it together as a community. I'm going to say, "We shall never forget," and then you repeat. So we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
Great. I'd like to invite up anyone who was assigned to light a candle to come up now. So as Vernon, Sarah, Michelle, Ava, Nate, Henry, Phoebe, and Myriam.
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah. I just have to lean forward. That's it.
Okay.
I get it. In memory of all the martyrs who lived and died as Jews during the darkest day of all lives, we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
I see.
In memory of all the helpless children who died so young and pure and innocent, we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
The third candle. In memory of all the mothers and fathers who died with their children in their arms, we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
It's really tricky.
In memory of all the families who were torn apart and lost forever, we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
In memory of all the heroes of the resistance who fought the Nazis, so few against so many, we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
The sixth candle. In memory of all hopes crushed and dreams shattered and people that are no more, we shall never forget.
We shall never forget.
Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hachol ve'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, berak hashamayim, tfilat adam, hachol ve'hayam, rishru shel that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart, the sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart.
Thank you all very much. So we're going to open up for dismissal at this point. If there are any kids who would like to ask Vernon any questions, he's willing to come up and take it if you didn't get to answer them. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow night for our memorial service at Myriam, 6 o'clock? 6:30.